Good evening to all. I'm Muhammad Tariq, interns team of Biodiversity Conservation Foundation. I'm here today to highlight about BCF India. BCF India is an organization working on conservation of wildlife and natural resources for more than 2 decades long. The sense of strategic planning based on the holistic approaches connects our team with a common goal. BCF India has started its contribution to nature conservation by integrating indigenous knowledge with our lifestyle. For instance, looking into the biodiversity in our daily life is the first step towards conservation, is our strong belief. Based on this, our research team contributing various research activities from the Gulf of Mannar to the Himalayas, encouraging young generations to involve in the diversified field of study in the conservation aspects from myrmecology to cethology, and exploring the diverse ecosystem across the country. BCF India always focused to conserve the diversity of various ecosystems through field-based research activities and awareness that would encourage proactive action for conservation of wildlife and wild habitats. We are strongly involving in educating young minds towards nature conservation and create awareness among people to live in harmony with nature. As the fact we are on the road of conservation with a holistic approach to it, and this approach drove us to extend to the virtual platform and use it effectively to enable conservation and connect young generations and common people with international prominent scientists. On behalf of BCF India, I am glad to welcome our Honorable Speaker Dr. Debbie Jewitt and all participants to this BCF India International webinar on the topic of Here Be Dragons, Planning for Land Cover and Climate Change Threats to Plants. Now, I would like to invite one of our interns team member to introduce about today's speaker. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening to all. On the behalf of BCF India, I'm Shruti, intern of Big Cat team. Privileged in introducing our today's speaker, Dr. Debbie Jewitt, ecosystem ecologist in Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, South Africa, to this 47th international webinar. Dr. Jewitt received a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Natal in 1994, a Master of Science in Conservation Biology from the University of Cape Town in 1995. She completed her PhD from University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg on land cover and climate change threat to savanna and grassland habitats in KwaZulu-Natal. And currently she is ecosystem ecologist in Ezemvelo KwaZulu-Natal Wildlife, which is a parastatal provincial conservation organization in South Africa. She carries out research in botany, ecology, conservation planning, climate change, land cover change, connectivity, gradient, and biodiversity. Her work involves the collection, synthesis, and reporting of information pertaining to landscape and ecosystem in province, in particular individual trend of rhino, prioritization for surveillance, monitoring and conservation action, the major threat to them, and to develop plans for and contribute to their long-term conservation. She is a drone pilot and uses drones for conservation purposes. Dr. Jewitt is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. She is a visiting researcher at the University of Witwatersrand, School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences, and is a climate reality leader with the Climate Reality Foundation and a qualified GIS trainer. She is an associate editor for the African Journal of Range and Forage Science, vice president of the Grassland Society of Southern Africa, and is a part of the ESRI/SCGIS Train, the Trainer Conservation GIS program. Deborah was accepted as TTT candidate for the SCGIS 2014 Conservation GIS training program in South Africa. In 2018, she was a keynote speaker at several conferences related to drones, including the South African Wildlife Management Association, DroneCon 2018, Drones Conference 2018. BCF is happy in connecting the eminent professionals, stakeholders, students, public, on this international webinar during this COVID-19. We are delighted to connect our eminent speaker, Dr. Debbie Jewitt, ecosystem ecologist in Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, on this virtual forum and waiting to listen on Here Be Dragons, planning for land cover and climate change threat to plants. Now the session is over to you, ma'am. Thank you all.
Good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to make time to listen to me. My name is Dr. Debbie Jewitt. I'm a conservation scientist and I work for Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife. And I'd like to speak to you today about dragons, perhaps not a normal topic, but I will explain more as we get into this. Can you all see my presentation screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Historically, in medieval times, maps often depicted dragons on their maps. And here are a few examples. The Epstop map in 1843, the Giovanni Liardo map from 1452, the Lennox globe, and they all depicted dragons on their maps. And they used the term here be dragons to indicate dangerous or unexplored territories at the edges of their known world. And these historical maps often indicated that southern and southeastern South Africa were strongholds for dragons. And in a seminal paper from the beginning of April 2015, some esteemed scientists published in Nature, one of the top science journals in the world, that they presented evidence that dragons could potentially resurge, and they weren't just creatures of legend and fantasy, and that the anthropogenic effect that we are having on the world's climate may inadvertently be paving the way for the resurgence of dragons. So they believe that they were basically in hibernation during the last ice age, and with climate change, that there might be a resurgence of dragons. But hang on a minute. KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province where I live in South Africa, it's mapped as a dragon hotspot because it's southeastern Africa. And we have extensive anthropogenic impacts on our landscape. And we must be at risk of a resurgence of dragons. Certainly, the rapid cumulative anthropogenic impacts are driving us towards uncharted and dangerous territory for the region's biodiversity, deserving the map label of Here Be Dragons, because the future landscape is likely to be very different from the current known landscape. So just to give you a map of where we are, South Africa is obviously a country in southern Africa, and KwaZulu-Natal, the province where I live and work, is that little yellow dot. And this falls in one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, the Maputoland-Pondoland biodiversity hotspot. And on the east coast, we have the warm climes of the Indian Ocean, and it goes up to the mountains in the west, the Drakensberg Mountains, which rise to about 3,300 meters. So not quite the Himalayas as you guys are used to, but still pretty cold, and they get snow in the wintertime. So this area is about a quarter of the size of California, and we have about 6,000 vascular plant species, of which 16% of those are endemic to this region. And then we have the influence of the tropical species coming from the north and the temperate species from the south. So it's quite a melting pot of species, and it's one of the reasons why we have such a high diversity, along with the variation in topography and altitude, geology, and soils. So the first thing, let's just understand a little bit more about the plants. And I focused specifically on grassland and savanna systems. And we collected data from 2,155 plots across the province. And this accounted for 1,643 species. And We ran a gradient analysis on this, and 3 variables out of the 51 that we tested showed a high correlation with the plant community composition that we had. And the most significant of this was mean annual temperature, soil base status, and then mean annual precipitation. And temperature across the province, because of the large altitudinal gradient, had an R-squared value of 0.72. We then used a hierarchical cluster analysis and created 23 unique communities in the province, plant communities. We then also looked at beta diversity or plant species turnover within the province using these 3 identified gradients that we had. So with the first one, mean annual temperature, turnover was relatively low until we got to about 18 degrees. And then diversity really increased a lot, or turnover increased a lot, sorry. And you can see the darker areas on the map on the top right. That shows where turnover in terms of temperature was the highest in the province. And then similarly, when we looked at mean annual or rainfall, specifically in February, so we a southern hemisphere country, so we have summer in the hot months. February is quite hot and dry. So where the median rainfall in the hottest month of February was below 107 millimeters in that month, we got quite high diversity. So again, the darker areas in that map show you where we had higher turnover. And then lastly, we looked at the soil base status, or in this case, cation exchange capacity. And we could see that turnover was highest at low soil cation exchange capacity. And again, that is depicted in the map on the bottom right. So when we combine these 3 layers together, the temperature, the precipitation, and the soil cation capacity, we can see areas where beta diversity turnover is highest in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Now, in terms of conservation, where would you want to focus your conservation efforts? It's where turnover is highest in your province, because that is where you are likely for a given area to encounter more species per area. So now that we've had a quick look at some of the plant diversity that we have in the province, let's have a look at some of the land cover and climate change threats to biodiversity in the province. So we were responsible for developing 3 provincial land cover maps dated 2005, 2008, and 2011 at the time of this study. And then we also had access to 2 national land cover maps dated 1994 and 2000. And we could use these land cover maps to look at loss of habitat over time. So if we just show this map of the province, the green areas is the natural habitat remaining in 1994. And then the gray areas in that map is the anthropogenically transformed habitat. And now we can slowly step through time to 2000, to 2005, 2008, and 2011. And what is abundantly clear is this rapid loss of natural habitat in our province. We then also conducted an intensity analysis, having a look at the change. So for this analysis, we only used the provincial maps, and you can look at the amount of change in the different time periods. So between 2005 and 2008, and between 2008 and 2011. And what we can see on the black bars to the left of this graph is the absolute amount of change happening in the province. So in the first period between 2005 and 2008, we had almost, or just under 8% of the province was transformed or changed. But in the second time period between 2008 and 2011, this slowed right down to about 2.5%. So change in the first period was really fast, but change in the second time period was quite slow. We could then also have a look at the drivers of change. And if you look under the gain column, You could see that we have timber plantations, a lot of agriculture because we are in the wetter part of South Africa. So agriculture is predominant, and then the built area. So all of these transformation changes happened at the loss of natural vegetation, shown as 6.52% loss. But what is really interesting, this just highlights the change between 2005 and 2008, is the amount of swapping in the landscape, particularly between the agricultural category and the natural vegetation category. So this is because farmers often will plow a land, plant their crops, and then allow the field to go fallow. The natural vegetation grows back, albeit it's secondary vegetation, and they allow the soils to regenerate, and then they will, in future, again, put that area to cultivation. So there's an immense amount of swapping in the landscape. So just looking at a particular land cover in one time doesn't give you a good understanding of the overall change that is happening in your province or in your area of interest. We could then also map the predicted change over time. So by 2011, only 53% of the landscape occurred in a natural state, and the average rate of habitat loss was 1.2% per annum. And we fitted a logarithmic regression curve to the data to predict the loss of habitat, and we can see that we will soon dip below 50%. And that's shown in the graph as the persistence threshold. And this is work that Flather and Bevers did in 2002. And below 50% of natural habitat, there's a rapid decline in the probability of landscapes being able to support viable species and populations. And then we look at the fragmentation threshold. That's when only 30% of your landscape is remaining in a natural state. And once this amount of habitat is lost, then the effects of fragmentation in your landscape become really important as opposed to the direct loss of habitat. And then the positioning of those remaining fragments in the landscape is really important. So with this immense amount of habitat loss, it's going to be really difficult for species to track changing climatic conditions. I'd like to just take you on a quick visual overview of some of the land cover types that we have in KwaZulu-Natal. So agriculture, which is formal agriculture, increased from 7.7% to 9% over that 6-year period. And this was driven primarily by dryland farming. We also have a lot of orchards, but then we have a lot of subsistence agriculture, and this increased rapidly, and particularly in our rural areas, from 3.3% to 7.4% of the landscape. But whilst it's not a monocrop like commercial agriculture, it can still be as intense as commercial agriculture in that there's very little natural habitat. So in this example, there is no natural habitat left. People have planted woodlots. They're planting small areas of sugarcane and areas of maize and vegetables. So there's very little natural habitat remaining in this landscape, even though the fields are quite small. And then this example is of the abandoned agricultural fields that we have, and they return to secondary natural vegetation. And this can be quite difficult to pick up on your satellite images when you're creating your land cover maps. So we like to try and create a specific class for this in our land cover maps and track these over time. And a lot of these old fields actually stem from the 1960s, when the government had agricultural subsidies and minimum selling prices, so artificial incentives, and they were thought to have encouraged cultivation in the 1960s. But of course, it was on marginal land, and so a lot of this land has been abandoned, but you can see the immense effect that this has had on the landscape. Then this is just an example of the timber plantations that we have. And you can see that it's really fragmented the landscape. There are little patches of grassland. And it should have all been grassland with small pockets of indigenous forest, but now it's the sea of trees. And if you think structurally about the landscape, species that live in grassland are adapted to a fairly short structured landscape. Grass is not very tall compared to your timber plantations that are very high. So for instance, certain types of butterflies or flying insects and birds, they now have to change how they navigate through the landscape because it's structurally very different to a grassland. We also looked at the amount of dams. As I said, we are the wetter side of South Africa, and the number of dams increased from approximately 14,500 to almost 21,000 dams in that period. And this represents a 45% increase in the number of dams and a 26% increase in the extent of dams. Now, obviously, this has a huge hydrological impact on the landscape. We also tracked erosion, and this is deep gully erosion, not sheet erosion. That's not that easy to pick up on your satellite maps. And there was a 44% increase in erosion over this time, but we think that's not necessarily new erosion, but rather a lack of stabilization of the existing erosion features, leading to an increase in the area of the erosion. So on these soils, they're duplex soils and they're highly erodible. Another land cover type was mining, and although the footprint of mining as a percentage in the province is quite small, there was a 90% increase in this land cover type. And this is driven primarily by the sand dune mining along the coast. So on the top picture on the left, you can see where they are actively mining. And then the smooth green bit in the middle is actually acacia trees that have come back once the mining is completed. But if you look on the right before the estuary, you can see the indigenous forest that used to be on these dunes, and you can see that they are highly diverse compared to this monoculture of acacia trees that have come back in the so-called rehabilitated areas. So that diversity is fundamentally altered, changed, and lost. Then the built environment increased by 1.2%. And the greatest proportion of the built environment increase was actually in our rural communal areas. And this was driven by an increasing number of roads in rural areas. So you can see each little muzi or homestead has a road going down to each family unit. And the number of roads is increasing across the province. Then another category that we like to track in land cover is the return to semi-natural category. So we've already spoken about agriculture returning, but there are a number of other categories that can also return to natural in inverted commas. And this is, for example, a rehabilitated mine dump. So it was an active coal mine, and that was the dump site, and the mine is now closed, and they have rehabilitated the mine and grassed it over, but obviously the soil and the toxins in that are not conducive to a natural environment. So even though from a satellite perspective it looks to be natural, it's nowhere close to primary natural vegetation. Then this is another interesting category that we found, and we are actually creating novel ecosystems, and this is due to alien plant species and invaders. And KwaZulu-Natal or KZN is rife with alien plants. And this used to be a commercial tea farm. So the light green areas on this photo are where the tea are. But now you can see a lot of wattle, the Australian wattle, Acacia mearnsii coming through, and then the kind of grey plant, which is solanum or bugweed, Solanum mauritianum. So this farm was abandoned, and there have been a lot of farms abandoned over time in KwaZulu-Natal, driven by a number of different factors. But this used to be a large packing shed that you can see there, but the building has been completely stripped down. So there's no more roofs, walls, and these opportunistic alien plant species are now growing up through the cracks in the foundation and slowly over time covering up that concrete structure that would have been there. So this is a novel example of a built category returning to natural, in inverted commas, but it's actually a novel ecosystem because it's almost purely alien plant species. So how does what we've learned about land cover change help us inform the science policy interface? Well, firstly, in terms of threatened terrestrial ecosystem legislation, we had our own legislation, which was gazetted nationally in 2011. And the aim of this was to slow down transformation of our threatened terrestrial ecosystems, and particularly criteria B, the rate of loss of natural habitat. Our research was the first to be able to show the rates of loss of natural habitat, and for the first time could inform this legislation. The IUCN now has developed a set of red listings for ecosystems, and whilst their criteria are similar, they're not exactly the same as what South Africa developed back in 2011, but we will be aligning. But again, that rate of loss of habitat is really important criteria. And this suite of land cover maps allow us to map that. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, Target 5, which was to, by this year, aim to halve or where feasible being close to zero by 2020, the rate of loss of natural habitat. So our research has allowed us to report back on the CBD targets. Then in terms of EIA regulations, in South Africa, there's been a relaxation of some of the environmental impact assessment rules. And we can clearly show that certainly in our province, this is not necessarily a good thing. There should be stronger rules to prevent this rapid rate of habitat loss. It also informs the climate change response strategy. So the South African climate change strategy has a peak, plateau, and decline trajectory. So our climate or greenhouse gas emissions will continue to rise until 2025. It will plateau to 2035, and only thereafter will we begin to see a decline. And so we are going to see an increasing climate effect on our diminishing natural habitats. Then in terms of protected area expansion to create new protected areas, as land gets less, the opportunity costs to set up new protected areas or even connectivity areas becomes more difficult, and it comes at a higher cost. And then South Africa also has some land expropriation rules where they don't want to see idle land, particularly in rural areas. But idle is a bad word to use because this is often where your biodiversity is. So we should rather be supporting biodiversity-friendly initiatives on these pieces of land rather than seeing them as idle. We also valued ecosystem services provided by natural capital in the province, and in 2011, this was valued at 149 billion rand. And as we projected the loss of habitat over time, we can see that by 2031, our natural capital will only be left at 89 billion rand. And who will pay for that loss? The taxpayer will pay. So yes, you can engineer many of the ecosystem services, but it comes at a huge cost where nature does that for you for free. And then the changes in land cover, loss of habitat, fragmentation, and the management of the landscape have resulted in the loss of biodiversity, species population declines, loss of ecosystem services, as well as rangeland degradation. So our rangelands, our grassland and savanna systems, contain about 3/4 of the country's terrestrial carbon stocks and account for 90% of the gross primary production. Land use change results in volatile soil carbon being released, and this has a circular effect of increasing greenhouse gas emissions and therefore exacerbating climate change. Therefore, we need to restore and properly manage natural vegetation and improve agricultural practices in order to curb CO2 emissions from land. So clearly, the current levels of habitat loss in our province are not sustainable. And many people around the world are recognizing the same thing around the world. And some really top scientists are now starting to say that business as usual is simply not an option, and understand how important natural habitat is in the world. Okay, so now that we've had a look at land cover change in the province, let's have a look at the predicted climate change impacts. And what we did here for the climate change was to look at environmental domains. And here one is mapping the metaphorical environmental stage, and your plants and animal species are the actors on that stage. So we simply did not have enough biological data to map the individual predicted species distribution ranges of all the species that we have. So we went instead, because we didn't have the data, to map environmental domains. So in order to do this, what you need to do is identify the specific environmental correlates of plant communities. And I've already shown you what those are. It's mean annual temperature, precipitation, and soil-based status. And then use these to define the environmental domains of these communities. And the environmental domains can then be modeled under future climate scenarios to understand how the domains may change and hence how the communities are likely to respond. So these are the future climate scenarios. So if you look at the intersection of the two blue lines, that is our current climate envelope, the mean annual precipitation on the x-axis at about 840 millimeters of rain per annum, and just over 18.2 degrees mean annual temperature. And we then modeled a suite of different future climate scenarios, an ensemble, and all 6 models predict a much warmer environment. In fact, up to about a 2 degree, by 2050, a 2 degree increase in average temperatures. But the models were not as consistent in their predictions around rainfall. And the climate change models, particularly in our region of the world, are quite poor, and there's not a lot of consensus. So 5 of the models predicted that it would get drier in the province, and 1 model predicted that it could indeed actually get wetter in the province. So just showing you the precipitation, the map on the left is the current precipitation, so ranging from about the drier areas of the province of about 200 to 700 mils, ranging right up in the wetter coastal and the high mountain areas to almost 2,000 mils of rain. And then the top map shows us the HADCAM model, which is drier and hotter. And then the bottom model, the GFDL, which is the wetter. And just to say that I will only be showing you the 2 extremes of the models, the HADCAM, which is the hotter, drier scenario, and the GFDL model, which is the hotter and wetter scenario. And then similarly, if we have a look at temperature, again, the present temperatures on the left and the hotter, drier HADCAM model on the top right, and the wetter and hotter model down the left. And we can see that things are really going to get quite a lot hotter in the province. Then this is just a map of the soil cation exchange capacity, and we need all 3 of these maps to model our environmental domains. So we used an iterative k-means clustering algorithm to define the 23 environmental domains. Remember, we had 23 different plant communities from our gradient analysis. And this is showing you the environmental domain. So it consists of 3 criteria: your mean annual temperature, your mean annual precipitation, and your cation exchange capacity of your soil. So this is the current environmental domains modeled on the more Mesozoic times in the last century. And then we can have a look at the HADCAM model, and you can see that the red environmental domains expand, and that central area that's shown in light beige, that gets overtaken and replaced entirely by a different domain. And then if we have a look at the wetter and hotter model, again, we can see that those purple areas are expanding down our coastline. Some of the green areas are expanding, the blue areas are contracting. So now, because the domain centroids are located in environmental space, we can simply use Euclidean distances to calculate the magnitude of change associated with the grid cell changing from a current environmental domain to a future one. And the Euclidean distances between current and future domain centroids were then used to generate a dissimilarity matrix, which was then used to generate a magnitude of change for each future projection. So here we can see the HADCAM model on the right and the GFDL model on the left. Now the darker areas, darker shades indicate a greater magnitude of change or potential novel communities. And the white areas indicate more stable areas. So these are potential macro refugia. Now, if we select the areas that are common to the 2 extremes of our ensemble of climate change models, we can then identify climatically stable areas for our environmental domains. And these are shown in blue on this map. But now remember the absolute loss of habitat between 1994 and 2011, and the ability of species to track these changing environmental domains is going to be hampered by loss of habitat and land cover change, which are recognized as the major drivers of biodiversity loss. So we then developed a vulnerability framework. So we have the climate stability index on the x-axis and the amount of habitat intactness on the y-axis split at 50%. So we have 4 blocks. So the top right or green block called robust, this is where we have 50% stable areas or at least 50% natural habitat remaining. And this is where you want your environmental domains or your habitat to be. And the kind of conservation activities that you would have for your environmental domains being in the green is to develop things like appropriate laws and policies and regulations and conservation plans. And these would cascade, as hierarchical in nature, it would cascade and be applicable to the other 3 blocks as well. But then as you move down the framework to where the climate areas are less stable and where you've got very little habitat left, you're then getting into very dangerous territory, and it will take increasing conservation efforts, resources, and risk. And then you might have to focus resources on species that are likely to become extinct. You might have to look at species translocation programs, perhaps ex situ conservation. You would have to have monitoring programs in place for the species that occur in these domains. And then you would have to reduce pressure on the species from other threats. And then the susceptible and constrained ones, the one has more habitat, but climate change is likely to be a big impact. And the other one, there's not a lot of habitat, but there's still, climate is not predicted to have too much of an impact there. So then there are appropriate conservation actions in that vulnerability framework. So we can now apply this vulnerability framework that we developed to our 23 environmental domains. And the larger the circle reflects the relative mean magnitude of change. So the bigger the circle, the greater the change we expect. And that's how quickly we would expect that environmental domain to move to the left in the graph. Now, if we look at environmental domains 2 and 8, they're circled in the top right of the blocks. These are considered robust, and both of these environmental domains occur in a World Heritage Site, the Maluti-Drakensberg World Heritage Site, and they occur at high altitude, and they require effective protected area management to maximize their resilience to climate change. And we shouldn't expect further habitat loss because they are in a protected area. But then if we have a look at environmental domain number 13, this is actually one of the domains that is predicted to increase in extent over time in both models. However, this is one of the coastal domains. And if you think back to the transformation land cover maps that I showed you, that is highly transformed and likely to be even further transformed. So whilst the environmental variables may permit a domain range expansion, species occurring in this area occur in fragmented patches, and so in reality would not easily be able to track these increasing domain ranges. So conservation measures that protect movement corridors or improve the matrix permeability would be appropriate. Again, I've just taken that vulnerability and mapped it back spatially. So the areas in red are the vulnerable areas. The areas in green are where they're robust and you don't have to be too concerned at this point in time. So immediately you can see where the sensitive areas are in the province and where we should be directing our conservation efforts. So any species that occurs in these red areas, we really need to think very carefully about how to conserve them. So in summary of the land cover and climate change aspect of our study gives an indication of the nature and extent of climate impacts in KZN using environmental domains. And our study explicitly links floristic pattern and climate variability and provides useful insights to facilitate conservation planning for a changing climate. And the spatial distribution of the environmental domain shows where species with a good dispersal ability, and that's really important, would be able to disperse in the increasing domains, but assuming that there are no barriers to those species movements. And then species restricted to the diminishing domains may become stranded and would require a targeted conservation effort. The model's predicted conditions suiting savanna species would increase at the expense of current grassland areas, and the identification of broad-scale stable areas can guide the location of future protected areas, which would limit climate change impacts on biodiversity. So we need to take this into account in our future planning. And then the vulnerability framework informs appropriate conservation actions. So what is the solution to land cover change and climate change? Well, landscape connectivity is an important tool for maintaining resilience to global change. And we have to increase the protected area state, and we have to limit further habitat loss. So knowing this, how do we then spatially prioritize the linkages in the landscape to build ecological resilience? Well, we know that resilience is enhanced by 1, high levels of biodiversity, number 2, heterogeneous landscapes, and number 3, by the maintenance of the disturbance regimes or the broad-scale responses of ecological and evolutionary processes. So if your system is adapted to fire, you need your fire regime to be operating, you need your appropriate grazing regime to be taking place, you need dispersal and colonization events, you need pollination events. So we set about doing this in the province. So using our land cover maps, we then set baseline resistant values. And this ranged between 0 and 1,000. So 1,000 had a very high resistance value. So it's an absolute barrier. It's a hard transformed surface like a tarred road or a building. Your plant biodiversity cannot exist there. Whereas the better the natural habitat, the lower that value would be. So that would be 1 or 0, close to 0. So this is where you want to keep your species. So in order to do the spatial prioritization of linkages, we used our beta diversity map. Remember, I said to you that you want to focus on areas where your turnover is higher, because this gives you your greatest bang for your conservation buck. We also then modeled our threatened plants, species, and communities. So we ran a systematic conservation plan, specifically only looking at plants. And then you want to include your climatically stable areas. So whilst the initial resistance values actually range from 300 through to 1,000, so all natural features set at 300, we then discounted areas of high beta diversity, threatened plant species areas, and climatically stable areas, allowing our range to now range between 1 and 1,000. So 1 is a perfect area. It's got high beta diversity, it contains threatened plants and species, and it's a climatically stable area. Then you come up with the final resistance values map. In this case, the darker the values, the lower the resistance. So you want to aim for your darker areas. And then you want to develop your linkages between your protected areas aligned to those strong environmental gradients that we've already identified. And in this case, it's an altitudinal gradient from our coastal areas up into the mountains. So that's an east-west gradient. And then also a north-south, picking up our tropical to temperate gradients that exist in the province. So now we used linkage mapper using our resistance map to identify linkages between our protected areas. So those are shown as the solid gray areas in the province, and then the wiggly dark lines are our corridors that we have identified between our protected areas. But once you have that resistance value, there is a lot of potential to configure the changes in the landscape. We also ran centrality exercise, and this identified areas that are critical to maintain connectivity in the landscape. So the more red the area is, both the protected area or the corridor linking it, the more critical it is to maintain linkages across the province. And here's just an example of where I've played around with the resistance values. So the first one on the left is the same map that you've seen. The central map, then I played around and I widened the corridors to map to meet a conservation target. In this case, 50% of the landscape. That is what connectivity would look like. And you can clearly see where the highly transformed areas are because the corridors can't go there. And then the map on the right, we had to reduce the resistance values because along the highly transformed coastal areas, we simply weren't able to put in corridors because it was so highly transformed already. So once you have this resistance value, you can then create linkages that you can, it's a planning tool. So if you know where a future protected area could be, you could find out where the linkages should be in the landscape between your future protected area and an existing protected area. And really, it's an amazing tool to help you plan and build resilience in your landscape. So to get back to the beginning, are there going to be dragons, a resurgence of dragons? Well, biodiversity continues to decline despite our increasing conservation efforts, and the future in KwaZulu-Natal is indeed uncertain. And the rates of habitat loss and predicted climate change impacts in KZN are indeed moving us towards uncharted and dangerous territory for the region's biodiversity. Our future landscapes will be very different from the current known landscape, and we need to acknowledge and implement what is required to sustain life on Earth. And we need to change how we interact with the planet. Without this, there may well be a resurgence of dragons. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debbie, for joining with us. On behalf of BCF India, we take this opportunity to thank Speaker Dr. Debbie Jewitt, ecosystem ecologist from Wildlife University of Witwatersrand and South Africa, is spending her valuable time during this COVID-19 situations for sharing her experience on hereby dragons, planning for land cover and climate change threats to plants. The session was highly informative and more scientific. It's a wonderful presentations you made it. Thanks for all participants who were joining today BCF India International Webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.